Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Needs Some Introduction. In today's episode, Sona and I will be discussing the fifth episode of the first season of The Agency. Has been renewed for a second season, by the way.
Exciting.
An episode called Rat Trap. Do you have any comments on the title here of the episode?
I mean, it seems very on theme. Several different storylines of people trying to suss out what other people are doing.
Well, I actually had to look up was there some other meaning for rat trap that I didn't know. Of course, it's a trap for a rat. Not surprising. Also, a dilapidated building is another definition of a rat
True.
trap.
Yes,
But
true.
the third one is that it's basically a very tangled and impossible to escape situation, which I think is what we're starting to see here, actually for multiple characters potentially.
I am not a fan of going to a tertiary definition, but I understand your point.
I do think it's the intention. And I also think that that's probably not a terminology that is commonplace anymore, as far as I know. I have never used the rat trap in that particular way.
Right. I've heard it in the first two
Yes.
examples, first two definitions. This is actually a very probably unique to me situation where my husband often uses words and we disagree on the meaning, and he is right if you go to the tertiary definition. So
If you go old timey definition, maybe
yes, if we were living in the 1930s, this would make perfect sense.
in the prohibition area, it meant
Yes.
any holiday plans, any Christmas plans, any travel.
My main plan at this point is to try not to lose my mind. The errands are just stacking up upon each other and the time is running out. But assuming it will all get done, because it always does, we will be staying relatively local, Long Island this weekend, New Jersey on Christmas Day. How about you guys?
Everyone's coming to us. We usually leave for Christmas and go up north, but we are staying here and hosting for everybody, just like we did for Thanksgiving. So it should be fun.
Fun.
And my wife hates the cleanup, but I'm the one who does all the cleanup. So I don't actually mind it that much. I prefer it to driving many, many hours. Since I
Understandable.
do
Yeah.
both of those things, so I will prefer leisure time to myself and not have to spend hours driving.
And all of the conveniences of home. You don't have to
Yes.
do all that
Yep.
premeditation of the packing for everything you could possibly need. With, I think, especially with a car trip, that tends to spiral because you don't have to fit it all into a suitcase. So it kind of turns into, and bring this, and bring this, and bring that. And next thing you know, you're trying to pack half your life away.
And we have literally not spent any Christmas here since my wife was pregnant. The rest of the time we've traveled for Christmas. Now that my daughter's older, keeping her entertained when she's the only child around is a full time job
Oh,
for. We have to tag team on it, and she is hyper because of the holidays. So it is 10 hours of nonstop activity to keep her entertained, if not more. The fact that we're home and she can play with her friends is going to be a huge relief to
mm-hmm.
us. So
As someone whose kid is hyper every day, regardless of the holidays or not, I get it.
yeah. Another thing I wanted to mention to you was a recommendation. I just watched this yesterday. This has been on Netflix for a few months now and is shortlisted for Best Documentary Film. It is certainly, almost certainly, I believe, going to be nominated. I liked it very much. It's not one of those documentaries that changes the way you see the world. It's not that kind of a form breaking type of documentary that I really gravitate to, but as just making something clear and having a real emotional wallop and something that might be in your wheelhouse professionally. This is a documentary called Daughters on Netflix. Have you heard of this documentary?
I think I've just heard that it's excellent and everybody should watch it.
It is about a father daughter dance program that exists in the prison system around the country.
Right. Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm.
And this is the first time I think they're doing it in Washington, D.C. It takes place over the course of years, but primarily the first father daughter dance. And you get to meet these fathers and you get to meet these daughters specifically. Like I said, this is not a documentary that breaks the form in any particular way, but just seeing these people who are in this rat trap of their own in a way, and that they are just the humanity of these characters, and just the button on this in the final title card, the men who participate in this event, that 95% of them do not recidify, or they're not recidivists, whatever the
Mm-hmm.
proper terminology is, which of course is much better than the population at large. And seeing these people suddenly snapping in that they need to live their lives for somebody else, which is something they've never done before. And also, by the way, almost to an individual had a terrible relationship with their own father. It's a very powerful message. And some of the sequences between the father and daughters, as you could imagine, extremely emotional to watch. So,
Hmm.
yeah. But yeah, it's uplifting and heartbreaking in equal measure. So I do recommend that. And like I said, it's probably going to get an Academy Award nomination, and it's very conveniently available on Netflix. So everybody should check it out. All right, so let's get into the episode. Rat Trap. I have concerns about the quality of agents we have here. They all seem to be very bad at separating their personal lives from their professional lives.
I loved it though. There was a lot funny about this to me.
Yes, this is if I was going to lead off with that. If this wasn't so like in tone, so grim, and almost certainly that some of these people are going to be dead at the end of this season of television, it would be straight up comedy because it's
Right.
crazy how badly they're doing this.
Yeah, I mean, especially the Owen storyline, I thought was,
Yes,
I just loved everything about it, honestly.
same. You said the guy out; he does not have experience, and like, yeah, he does everything wrong.
His whole like, do I need a cover? And you idiot, you're not good enough to have a cover, kind of thing. And you knew he was going to end up in bed with the secretary, and his admissions afterwards about how badly it went. I thought all of it was very funny.
Yes, all of it was great. I also like Martian's analysis of it afterwards, being like, "This was one of the most incompetent things I've ever
Yes.
seen." However, I think you got us a really valuable clue, which might explain all of how this agency operates in general, or maybe how our intelligence agencies
Maybe that's
themselves.
how it really happens.
Exactly. I mean, if you go by like John Le Carre, which who had experience as an operative, and I'm not sure if you take all of that with a grain of salt, but according to his stories, that's very much what it is, right? There's a lot of incompetence. There's a lot of people saying like my personal life never gets involved, and of course that's all a lie. And somehow they're able to pretend that they intended all of that to happen at the end. So
Hmm.
maybe that's the same thing we're seeing here. I want to spend a minute on the opening scene visually. This is not Joe Wright. This is a director. I've never heard of this director before. I should look at her credits later. But I love this opening sequence where we see Martian in interrogation with Dr. Blake again.
There was to me something different about the way
Mhm.
this episode was
Yep.
put together compared to the others with the voiceover and the cutting back and forth. And I really enjoyed all of it, but I did feel like it was a distinct difference in tone compared to the prior episodes.
So this director is Zetna Fuentes, who I've never heard of before, who has directed some Apple TV. This is just a TV director, directed episodes of This Is Us, The Old Man, Bosch Legacy. So very active. There's many directors like this that seem to pick up the baton from the main directors of a series of TV. But to that point, I think there's a different flavor here and a different focus, and I agree. But in this very opening sequence, which I love this idea being reinforced visually what Dr. Blake is getting at, saying, "Tell me about Paul." And he's like,
Mm-hmm.
"What's there to tell?" And obviously that's not accurate because she's like, "But what are you talking about? You were Paul." And he's like, "Yeah, I was, but why does that matter?" Which of course is total BS because we know that he's continuing this relationship with Samia. That relationship is founded on this personality, this persona of his. So it's just very interesting that he's saying this. But most importantly, all the sets here, there's many panes of glass and mirrors, etc. And there is these mirrors, this feedback loop within the images where you see him repeating over and over and over again. And the camera is panning like past him, the actual person in the room, and then into this reflected image of himself in the mirror. And of course, behind that one is another one, and behind that one is another one. And it just illustrates visually the weight of this, right? Of having all of these personas and how they're compounding on each other, and that they're fading out over time, but how all these people are still part of him, or how he's denying that they're part of him. And I just thought this was a really interesting scene that kind of gets at a lot of the thematics that we're going to see over the course of this episode, already seen in the season itself.
I don't think I even picked up on that. So I appreciate you pointing it out.
I would recommend you check that out. I just think I love the way that is represented there. But beyond that, what do you think the show is trying to tell us here about the stresses of having these multiple personas that he has to juggle simultaneously? Do you think that it is that he has some way of compartmentalizing these people, or that they're all facets of himself, or that he has no true identity? And I can add that once again, since we spend so much time with Danny here, how do you think that Danny is exploring her different personas here as well as an agent?
I think they have set up here the beginning and the end, theoretically, right? Of an agent's life undercover. We see Danny going through the very beginning stages of learning how to do this. And then we see him having come out of 6 years undercover, and who knows what he did before that, even dealing with trying to reinitiate his regular life and the conversations with his daughter about how he wasn't around and all of that. I think the point here is that it's impossible to do this and keep your sanity, which is one that was also made a few episodes ago. How nuts am I? Am I nuts enough to keep working here? But I'm also nuts enough to go do this again. To me, the point is that no one can really do this and expect to not be losing it on some level. Unfortunately, part of what our government does in needing people to do this is pushing them to their limits and trying to figure out where that limit is, which we saw happening with Danny. And then we see happening on the other end with Paul, with the doctor trying to figure out, I think she's trying to figure out whether he's too far gone or not.
Yeah. Or at least having him ask himself that question, right? Like as a truly therapeutic exercise. Because if he really believes the things he's saying, I think he thinks that he's saying what they want to hear, but that's not possible, right? So there's some aspect to have him acknowledge that at least.
Yeah, and he's not willing to leave this life behind, partly because he fell in love. There's that. He's not willing to walk away from Samia. And you see how he is still needing or wanting, I'm not sure, to keep Paul alive, keeping this persona going, possibly to protect her, possibly to protect himself. He's still living as Paul, partly.
Yeah. And there's limitations to that as we see over the course of this episode for sure. I mean, just in not only his psychology, but in the reality of maintaining any identity under scrutiny, this alternate identity.
Theoretically, the way this is supposed to work is when they pull you out, Paul is gone, regardless of whether you were in love or not. And that's what you agreed to. So now he's really mucking up the works, unbeknownst to most people, by keeping Paul alive.
He's got the Chinese intelligence agencies and also multiple African intelligence
Yes.
agencies looking into his background. It's not going to hold up much to scrutiny much longer.
But you asked some really good questions at the beginning of our exchange here, and I'm not sure I answered any of them. But did you have a thought about that?
You touched on most of that there. It's not, I don't think there's a clear answer in what the show is presenting. So there's quite a few interesting things about this very short scene. I'm spending a lot of time on it, not only because of the visuals, but also because it raises this question again, which of course is thematically reinforced over the course of the episode of maintaining this persona. He's saying, oh, that's not part of me anymore. And she's like, but it was part of you. And who was Paul? Was that just invented? And he's like, no, Paul had friends. Paul had readings at the local coffee shop, which is funny. Just these little clues of this whole alternate life he was leading that seems to have no relationship to the person we have seen so far, and being like a professor that everybody loved to hang out with and go out for drinks and participate at readings at the coffee shop. And once again, not the person we've seen up until this point, but that he could maintain that and even enjoy it, but then throw it all away afterwards. Not just the passport, but the lifestyle as well. And of course, the inability for him to actually do that, which we know proof of, because if he truly could do that, then why is he still in this relationship with Samia, right? That is very interesting to me. And beyond that, we also see a little bit of the cultural setting for what happened here, where we're thinking like, well, how could he have just like walked away from Samia? We do see just one line of dialogue that explains that a little bit, in that it used to be a much more multicultural city he was living in. But then, of course, with the civil unrest, it became less international. So you can imagine a lot of the students who want to go and say, oh, I want to spend a semester there or whatever, all of a sudden they all disappear. And it kind of makes sense that Paul, this character as well, moves on once most of the Europeans have left the city, right? So that has some rationale for it. I still don't buy fully that Samia would be so chill with him moving on, but it does at least give you some explanation that if she has seen all of her students and all of the demographics of the place changing as the unrest escalates, that he now also leaves is probably not a surprise to her anymore. But that still is pretty convenient plotting, I'd say.
Do we know for sure what Samia's deal is yet?
Yes, that's of course the big question mark here.
I always go back to that when I think of her reaction, because for this to be such a great love that this man who professionally goes undercover and his life is at stake if his cover is blown, is willing to risk that. I'm assuming there was some mutual feeling there. And she does text him after he goes, right? Saying, or email him saying, I'm not over it. I love you. I won't contact you again, or something to that effect. That reaction still doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, the fact she was so chill when he broke it off in that first episode is very surprising.
I mean, I guess maybe she's just a tough cookie. Some people are. Maybe she went home and cried her eyes out. We don't know. But, it doesn't quite add up.
Of course, Osman doesn't think it adds up either. We see him doing a lot of investigation here. He's looking at his Facebook page, which on the one hand, I was like, wouldn't they have scrubbed that all? But I'm like, yeah, he's not going to just disappear off the face of the earth, at least for
Right.
some period of time. In case someone is observing him, he probably needs to maintain some semblance of that life. I do find it surprising and questionable. I guess he knows how to get around. I was going to say, it is kind of weird that they are tailing him in this episode, and yet he shows up at work, basically, right? So if someone was
I
truly
thought that was strange
right,
too. Yes.
although we do know that he always has to go through, what do they call it,
Airlock. The
the
airlock.
airlock. So wherever he goes, he always goes through the airlock. I
Fair.
assume that is to shake off any potential tails,
Yeah.
because even we saw when Henry and him walked to the office, they have like a way to get there, pretty much probably like the most convoluted way possible, because the intention is to lose any tails they may have. And I assume that once they pass through the airlock, they are also being tailed by an agent who, of course, is
That's a
tracked.
good point. I had forgotten about the airlock when I watched this because I had the same question.
They do not address it here, but I assume there's always that same. Of course, at some point, you can't just show them taking 5 minutes or 10 minutes of the episode to show them to arrive at the office. But I assume that is the process every single time. But Osman, of course, is extremely curious about him. And I have to say, I'm really starting to like this Osman character, even though he might be, he may potentially kill somebody. Oh, so Osman goes and talks to somebody who works at a consulate in London, somebody else who he has some kind of contact with. So now he knows for sure that there's something questionable about Paul. I was trying to remember the name they use for him. He says so many names, but Paul. There seems to be very limited history on him, which of course is exactly what you expect to see when you have an agent in the field. As a matter of fact, Martian is, when he's talking to Blake at one point, mentions the fact that your identity is only a windshield, right? Like it keeps most of the debris off of you if no one's looking too hard, but anything going fast enough or big enough is going to smash right through that glass.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, all it takes is a little bit of digging to say, well, give me like a 10-year history on this person. It's like, well, we only have 6 months of history on this person before he showed up in Ethiopia. So it's like,
Right.
there's a big question mark. And eventually Osman shows up at the hotel where Samia and Paul are having lunch or breakfast, brunch, whatever it is. So this is really brazen. This is the beginning of me asking questions, if I haven't already begun asking them in previous episodes, of just like how unprofessional he's being and not revealing this to his coworkers. This is very problematic. And by the way, he's going to have huge consequences. So it's not even like it's a plot hole that the show is ignoring. It is the driver of the plot, because we see in the framing conversation here, right, that he's still in this hospital gown. And obviously
Mm-hmm.
something's happened. He has this bruising under his eyes, or under one of his eyes. And he explicitly says, now, I guess if there was a question, unless this is all part of the subterfuge as well, that Sammy is the problem, he says that what he didn't realize at the time while he was doing this investigation and trying to figure out how Samia figured into it was that he had become a threat to Samia, which is definitely one way to read the clues here. So what did you think about this? The what's kind of being revealed in this flash forward, I guess, to some terrible thing having happened.
To your point, Henry did know at one point, right, that he was meeting with Samia because he met him at her hotel and
Right.
was like, what are you doing here? So it's not completely unacknowledged that he, at least at some point, was keeping in touch with her. Although they probably do believe now that that has ended, given the conversation they had and his walking away from the hotel
Right.
in the middle of the night or whenever it was, midnight. I do think they've laid the groundwork for at least people knowing there is an issue there. It goes back to the theme song that you love so much, right? Love is blindness, and all
Right.
of these bad decisions he's making because he is not focused on what should be important and his own self-preservation. I think if anything, right, he's putting her preservation above his, maybe not making the right decisions, but in his head, that's what he thinks he's doing. that same theme that we feel is a little bit on the nose sometimes of
Yes.
how to put together that deep love and the irrationality that comes with that with a job that does not allow for any irrationality whatsoever because the consequences are so severe.
Do you think we're supposed to read any of his fixation with her? Part of it is his not knowing. In other words, do you think there's some aspect to her fascination, that his fascination with her, and maybe the other way around as well, the fact that he really can't figure her out, right? He's wondering, always questioning her true intentions. And even though they got into this relationship innocently, he has seen her be a political operative. He's curious, questioning why is she in London? Do you think in some ways he is investigating her and how he might have been compromised in the past? And that is part of what has him on the hook with her still.
I was wondering, in connection with what we see of him now as a solidly middle aged man, in my mind,
Mhm.
whether he's ever been in this type of situation before in any of his other missions. Has he ever?
Right.
We know he had a relationship with Poppy's mother, obviously, but we don't know what kind of relationship that was. Is this the first time in his life that he's been truly in love? Has he been in love while undercover before? How did that end? This is not directly what you asked, but all those questions are kind of running in the back of my mind. I will say, and this is maybe a little cynical of me as a middle aged woman, I think men have this romantic idea of having met their match. And I think it could be that he feels he's met his match in her, that she does have all of this stuff going on that she doesn't want to talk about, just like he does. And
Right.
it does make him curious. And that she's an enigma. And isn't that
Yes. Mhm.
romantic?
Right.
So I don't know. Maybe I'm being cynical. Maybe it is more what you're getting at of literally for national security. He needs to know what's going on with her. That is possible too. To me, it's not coming across that way. It's coming across as a more romantic spin,
Right.
but there is possibly something to what you're saying.
Part of the reason I thought of that was I was going to kick off this entire conversation as the biggest mystery I have on this show is how is Paul still have his job, or whatever we're calling him now, Martian, have his job at the end of the season? Because if he is being blindsided by all of this, it's like, wow, he's really, really bad at being a spy. And then as we were just having this conversation right now, and that joke was still playing out in the back of my mind, I started to think that maybe that's how he gets out of this, whether it's sincere or not. He could say, well, she showed up in London, and was I made? And if that's the case, then I needed to know. Right. And then, of course, then she's involved with the Chinese, which, of course, by the way, he's kind of starting to have this investigation in the open in the office. So maybe he thinks he can use it as cover for his relationship. To my original point, I do think that there's a true emotional connection between the characters, but I do wonder if part of the attraction, in a way, imagine that he did not suspect she's an agent. And now he does suspect he's an agent and thinks to himself, how did I not see this? I need to know more. Right. And I think I wonder if the mystery of her more than the person of her is what drives him to her.
I think it is quite possible that that's the case. Yes. Because I will say also, I like this actress. I like this role. I have
Mm-hmm.
not seen anything particularly explaining his undying love for her.
I, I completely agree that I do like her performance. I especially like how she is so frustrated with her interactions with him and with Osmond, and how she's really feels trapped in a lot of ways by her circumstance, and maybe legitimately, if she's not an agent, of course, is trying to improve her situation and get divorced and maybe find a way to move to London, not even to be with him. Of course, that would be nice considering she has this affection for him, but just in general, just to not be living the limited life she has. I buy all of that. I just don't buy the relationship between the two of them. I agree.
Yeah, obviously, we're just seeing snippets and they're kind of trying to seize these moments together. And based on what we saw, they've been through at least one very traumatic experience before. Apparently, they share an interest in politics,
Right.
but we don't see any kind of dynamic between them where I'm
Right.
like, yeah, I get it. I get why he couldn't give this up.
Right. The most emotional they are with each other is probably on that bridge. You really feel his
Mm-hmm.
anguish, but it's mostly him not being able to understand, am I right or am I wrong? Is she playing me or not? And him not being able to figure that out. And on her hand, on her side of things, I can understand her being like sick of this. Like, I'm done with this. I'm so sick of this. This is like every interaction I have in my life. Why does it have to be this way? If you read it at its surface level. And so I buy that. But once again, I don't see in the flashback, I don't see in their current interactions this deep affinity for each other. And a lot of it, I think, in a way, has to do with the fact that when they are together now in London, when we mostly see them, he's so suspicious of her all the time. He's interrogating her constantly. So it's very hard to see what the
Fair,
original appeal was, right?
fair. And I mean, I do think I like both of these actors
Yeah.
quite a bit, but I don't necessarily see any raw chemistry even.
Yeah. Yeah. Even there is in the tradition of like film noir, for example, and you could argue this is kind of a noir. I think spy shows in general kind of are noirs, but if you read it in that way, there also is oftentimes the motivation for the lead investigator in a noir oftentimes is to rescue the woman in need. And
Sure.
once again, I don't see her. She's not like so trapped by her circumstance. She seems to be pretty improvisational and pretty sharp and pretty resilient. So I don't really see that aspect of it either. I don't think he's just trying to, save the damsel in distress.
Distress.
Exactly. Back at the office, the phone in the bin of phones has rung with a text message. I found your bike.
Mm-hmm.
Code name Armstrong for this case, by the way, for this mission.
I was thinking they'd go with Schwen, but I'm not really a bike person.
Well, the Lance Armstrong thing could have multiple connotations there, considering
Fair,
where
fair.
this might go. And of course, this means that Coyote, they've reactivated this case. There's an interesting clue where I like how subtle the clues are, where the text message came based on his GPS from this location. And this location, it's like the safe space where the Coyote would normally meet with contacts. So that if they know where Coyote's secret meeting space is, then obviously Coyote has spoken. He's either giving information willingly or they've beaten it out of him or something, but they know they're winking at the agency that they know who he is. And also, speaking of those multiple investigations, he is curious, given Samia's situation, what might be the actual mission behind what she's doing there. So he's discovered a little bit more about what she's doing. She's actually shared some of that with him as well. Pretty soon discovers that it seems that the Chinese are the ones who are involved here, right?
This is my recurring theme of maybe I'm not smart enough to watch a spy show. It wasn't clear to me. I know they said something about the Chinese having control of the area. To me, that was not a sufficient explanation for why the Chinese were involved. Did I miss something there?
Well, I mean, I think that the breadcrumb trail is that he says, who do you think is behind this? And they said, yes, these different delegations are meeting, but there's nothing that we see on our radar. And I think he just asked him, this other agent, straight up, who should we talk to? Like, your gut instinct, who do you think is trying to get involved? And like, well, from the chatter, we know the Chinese are interested. And then he goes to the Chinese desk about anything that they might see. And then they have said, oh, yeah, we have some chatter. It doesn't seem to be anything shady at this point, but there is this Chinese operative, apparently somebody who's like living this playboy lifestyle in London, but apparently seems to connect the dots between these other agencies, like willing to basically sell these contacts. And it turns out that is, I think at this point, pretty clearly that is the person who's coordinated this, I should say, for the Chinese government, this connection.
I actually got all of that. I didn't really understand the why.
Why the Chinese are curious, interested? Is that what
Yeah.
you're saying? Oh,
Yeah.
I think
Just
they
to
just want
have
to
control.
control.
Yeah.
It goes back to what they said at the very top of last week's episode, the Sudanese or the Sudan, because of this
The
unrest.
resource rich thing.
Right. It's they have
Okay.
oil.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
They have oil,
I
they
had
have gold,
forgotten
and they
about
have
that.
access to the Red Sea. So therefore, the
Okay.
Suez Canal, which of course connects the Far East and the West, the Chinese would be involved. They're already very politically active in Africa. This would just be a big target, obviously, if they could control that area.
I had
And
forgotten about those factors. Thank you.
triple threat, as they called it. And since this Coyote thing is back up in the air again, they send Owen. Of all the people, Owen has to go. I guess because he's Coyote's handler. Is that why?
Yes, I think so. And that he, better than anyone else, would understand what is going on in that environment and clues to Coyote and where he is that could have been left behind.
Right.
For example, he knew Coyote wouldn't have a cat.
Yes. It's not actually Coyote's cat. This Russian girl shows up very suspiciously.
Mm-hmm.
He sleeps with her, which is bad move, buddy. Bad move. I don't know what kind of training they're giving these people, but you have to assume that is not on the up and up.
I mean, even letting her cook for him, I felt was a little bit risky. What if she
Right? You don't know.
poisoned him or something?
Exactly.
And also, just a moment to observe that beautiful glass closet. Wasn't that amazing?
Yes, really was.
Really lovely. Although, I think one of those situations where, similar to when you have glass cabinets in your kitchen, you better have your stuff in order. Otherwise, it's going to be like your mess is on display. The way this glass closet was set up, it was really lovely.
You're going to have to put that in your apartment.
I live a life of chaos. I couldn't. I count on closing doors in order to have some semblance of order.
I'm starting to do, by the way, with this show, I'm starting to do what you do oftentimes where you'll say, like, we'll be watching a show and you'll comment on an actress's wardrobe. And I'm like, oh, I didn't even notice that. Sometimes those observations are just like, oh, I like that purse. But sometimes I think they actually give you some insight into the character as well. And I'm like, oh, I completely missed that. I'm kind of doing that with the guys in this show where I'm like, I want Osmond's boots.
That's
And I'm
so
like,
funny. I'll have to look.
and when Fassbender's getting on his motorcycle, I'm like, I want that jacket and those pants.
He has a great look. He has a great look in this show.
He loses that jacket, unfortunately.
Yes, he does.
Let's wrap up Owen's storyline and then we'll move over to Danny.
Sure.
There's so many characters that have plot here and they all kind of parallel each other.
Yet the brother-in-law still missing.
Yes, still missing. Good point. Missing in action. Not really missing in action, actually.
No,
He
no, no.
reclaimed, but
Yes.
yeah. So Owen, so he does everything wrong, somehow gets rescued from there. But there is a big clue that he finds, which is Valhalla.
Huge clue.
It seems like he has written this on the glass intentionally for someone to find.
Agree.
Did you get the sense that Owen is there fogging up the room because this was a way they were going to share information? Or was he just turning it on because he's like, oh my God, I've been made. There's probably a sound recording device here. So he's just trying to mask the phone conversation. Did you get a sense of that?
You know what this is reminding me of? The show's name is escaping me. You and I watched it together. It was partly set in the UK. There was like the Jinn was like the terrorist mastermind.
The veil.
The Veil. So they were leaving messages on the window glass, the car's
Yes. Mm-hmm.
glass window, right? So maybe this is a known piece of spycraft that we just aren't aware of to leave messages like this for each other. I mean, it does seem like something someone would do, in my mind, in desperation. You know, well, maybe someone will come here and figure this out.
But if this girl has been staying in the apartment, she's been fogging up that glass. So hadn't she seen it?
She may have seen it and just disregarded it. I personally, if I saw it, would probably put my hand right through it and be like,
right. You clean it off, right?
Assuming that I am who I say I am and just
Right.
innocently squatting in my boss's apartment. But
It does seem that
yeah,
they've come to that conclusion, right? At the end, when he's getting debriefed Owen when he's back in the UK.
it feels that way. I still have questions about that. To me, she was acting a little
Many
weird.
questions, yes. The fact
Then
this girl
again, she
shows up
moved in
and
her
just throws herself at
cat.
Owen, yeah, very sketchy.
Well, she's mad at her boyfriend. They're in a fight,
It's one way to get revenge.
theoretically, if all of this is true.
Right, right.
I don't know. I'm not a pet person. I'm not an animal person, but I feel like it's one thing to say we had a fight, so I decided to sleep here. I think it's a really, to me, that's a breakup once you took your cat, but I don't know.
Well, if he's not going to watch the cat, maybe he's not a cat person, then, someone's got to watch the cat.
I guess I like how she yelled at him for not feeding her.
I also like the fact that she's like, oh, you saw the cat? As if like the cat has disappeared into the apartment,
Yes.
which can happen. Cats can disappear for a while. But I just find it funny that is the cat mad at her? Like the cat's like, you should go back to your ex-boyfriend. The cat preferred the other one, I guess.
Maybe. And his response of, did I feed your cat? No, I didn't. Which is the same reaction I would have.
Not to harp on the cat too much, but I do find it funny. First of all, he says, well, there's a cat here. And that Henry is like, who cares about the cat? I'm like, if there's a living cat in the apartment,
I agree.
someone's been to the apartment. This is a big clue, people.
And because pet people usually feel fairly strongly for their cats, I mean, I guess you could hire someone to look in on your cat. Otherwise, you wouldn't leave your cat behind.
Absolutely. All right. So enough on the cat.
Enough on the closet, enough on the cat. Back to Owen.
This is very funny, I think. I'm not sure if they were
So
supposed to get
funny.
anything more from it other than, once again, just showing how inept people can be when they're not properly trained for this. Owen is able to track down the gun, right, by rummaging, but, it takes him not that long to find the gun. So he does have some ability of putting himself into the coyote's shoes there. he just, as soon as he thinks he's compromised, he just throws her into like the bathroom and locks her in there or something. It's very funny.
I think
And
it
then he
was the
gets,
closet. I assumed it was the bathroom originally, but I think in the end it was a closet.
I guess it wouldn't be the bathroom because I guess you wouldn't be able to lock it. Then, I mean, how would she lock her in? I guess he just ties the doorknobs together or something.
I assumed there was a chair under the doorknob or something when I thought it was the bathroom.
It would be funny if it also had a glass door and we could see her trying to get out the whole
I
time.
know. I was just thinking that too.
She's pounding on the glass the whole time
It'd be so awkward
with the cat
to
in there
be
too,
in
maybe.
there with the glass door with your prisoner looking at you.
Exactly. All right, let's move over to Danny. This is really fascinating as well. First of all, the fact that maybe she did accurately read the situation with Reza. He's able to identify the fact that she speaks Farsi. Do you think that he's feeling her out as an agent? How do you read all those interactions? Do you think he's on the up and up? It's so interesting to read this, to watch this show. It's part of what I enjoy about it. I really can never place anyone's motivations like at any time.
Yes. Well, so I was thinking back to our discussion about last week's episode and her little smile
Right, right.
and how we thought that was a strange reaction, together with his purported concern, maybe real, maybe not, that he's going to kind of get in trouble for sexually harassing
Mm-hmm,
her,
mm-hmm.
which I thought was interesting in that, to be honest, in all the men that have hit on me in my professional life, none of them has ever feared the consequences of doing that.
But things have maybe changed a little bit recently,
I was
maybe.
about to say this was before the Me Too movement when I was young. And also, there is a bit of a power dynamic there as well. So I thought it was an interesting reaction from him that it looks like he has called her specifically to make sure she's not going to get him in trouble. And I think she did play that exactly right. I wonder if she anticipated that that would be something that was going to happen and cross his mind, because I certainly did not, but that was again colored by my own personal experience. So I guess in the end, she did kind of play it right. Now she's kind of done him this favor of
Right. Mm-hmm.
not having any consequences to hitting on her. And she's starting to endear herself to him by speaking a little Farsi, right? Which I guess lucky for her that she happened to be in the presence of that phone conversation
Right.
and could seize the moment there. To me, it seems like he is taking her at face value to be who she is. What do you think?
From what I've seen in the show, I 100% agree with you that that's exactly how it's playing out. The reason I start to now second guess myself is, and once again, this is subterfuge as well because of the way she gets abducted later. But if we do take that information at face value as well, that he is not just like a seismologist that maybe is affiliated in some ways with the Iranian military, but that he is actually an operative of some kind or like facilitating them in some way, like maybe part of their nuclear power projects as well. If that's the case, he may have been like, I'm suspicious of her. All this is to say that if he is simply an educator that is going to get her away into Iran in, with a pretty good cover, then he on the surface is just exactly what we described. If he's an operative, then his agenda obviously is completely different. And I guess we have to
Of course.
read
Yes.
them. That we can have to balance those two readings at the same time.
Right. Agree.
But I agree that unless he's a very good actor, and maybe he is, maybe he's a true trained agent, but he's not an Owen. But if I read it the same way. I read that he probably did have warmer feelings for her. He wants to be her mentor. He maybe even admires her a little bit for not taking the easy way to win him over, and simultaneously wants her to not call him out because obviously the difference between different cultures. A UK university probably would take her complaints to heart, and that could make his work, regardless of whether it is nefarious or not, more difficult, obviously. And now, like you said, she's done him a favor. She knows a little Farsi. She's learning Farsi, which of course makes him think like, oh, she really wants to go to Iran with me. And if he's still sexually interested in her, things will be very different when they're in Iran. And like you said last week as well, this is a little bit of her playing hard to get as well. So maybe there's keeping him on the hook a little bit. So I think
Yeah,
all those
I agree with
dynamics are
all of
playing
that.
out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree.
Aside from the Valhalla discovery in the bathroom, there's also another big discovery here in the pursuit of Coyote. Although this one probably would have come up either way. This other agent, the one who comes to clean up after Owen, and extricate him as well from the situation safely, goes to that meeting place and looks in this electric box, and there is another burner phone in there. These agents love their burner phones.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, they investigate it, looking for any possible clues. Is there anything in the notes, anything in text messages, any contacts? Nothing, 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 nothing. But they do find a calendar event. And in that calendar event is a lockbox or a
Right.
locker in some location with an address and a code. So, of course, that is a huge, huge piece of
Huge.
information. So, I guess we'll discover what is in that locker next week, most likely. Poppy comes to visit her dad yet again. And we do find out a little bit that he was married to her mom. So it's not like it was just an affair or they were just partners. They
Right.
were married. So he has tried to have a traditional nuclear family in the past, but I can't imagine, given what we're seeing here in the show, that that is ever going to work for anybody.
Agree.
Anything else you wanted to mention about their interactions?
We'll get to this. I'm worried for her.
I am worried for her as well. Later on, pretty interesting scene. Martian knows that he's being tailed. He allows himself to be mugged. We see a flashback to him being trained to not be a good fighter, because if he's just an English teacher, why would he be a good fighter?
And this is something, you had mentioned about the director. This is something different to me in the construction of this story. I feel like they weren't really doing similar things to this before, but I really enjoyed it here.
The actual mugging or the
The
flashback?
flashback. I enjoyed the mugging. No, the story construction of seeing the event happen and then seeing the flashback, the training for it.
That might have been in the script rather than the director's choices, but regardless, I do agree. I like the way that they injected that into the story in the moment. I thought that was well done.
One of the things that made this episode very fun to watch for me.
I mean, if it was me personally, I would, in all my persona, just take MMA fighting at whatever MMA gym there is. So I would be proficient when I got my ass kicked because it's going to happen if you're an Asian at some point.
Well, I mean, I think that's the thing is he is proficient, but he had to pretend not to be. So he would have had to create in his Paul Lewis persona, Paul Martin, Paul Lewis, whoever he was,
Lewis, yeah.
that he's a guy that loves being at the boxing gym.
Right.
And he hadn't done that. So the ship had sailed.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's true. He had to backfill that.
Yeah.
To that point, even if he was proficient at it, he has to pretend that he's not aware that someone's coming up behind him
True.
to beat him up, because most English teachers walking around are not hyper wary that they're going to get mugged in the middle of the street. What did you think about the sequence where Samia and Paul, let's call him, are having this brunch together and Osmond shows up? I think I brought it up earlier, but we never really touched that. We didn't get into detail on it.
It just felt so awkward. And I think purposefully very awkward to watch for me, even translated across to the viewer. There are so many layers to what's going on that are being unsaid.
Of course, that is what leads to the mugging later on. But what is so crazy about it, and going back all the way to the, how does Martian continue to maintain his job at this point? Because there are some pretty big question marks here as to why did you get mugged? Like, Dr. Blake actually asks him that. Just a coincidence that someone mugged you? Like, I can't imagine that anyone in the agency thinks that there's not more to his mugging.
Right.
And the fact that he's dismissing it all. Yeah. So all of this seems very questionable, and how it's being dealt with within the agency. And I don't mean like that it's badly written. I think this is all intentional setup. At this moment, if he doesn't think people have their eyebrows raised, he's off the mark on that. Long story short, he has to come forward with this relationship because, like you said, he gets mugged for his jacket later on, or at least that's the cover story. They have Poppy's identification now, right? So she is definitely at risk in being used as leverage point. Something interesting that does happen during that conversation, he starts to ask Samia, why are you here for real? And what did you think about her response? Because she's telling him that you don't really want to know. So she knows that she is in maybe too deep. And do you believe, and maybe you do, given on your previous answer, do you believe that she is trying to use that as a way to not answer his question? Or do you think that she really is believing who he is and that she doesn't want to entangle him even further in it?
I think she doesn't want to entangle him any further. I think that part is true. I think based on everything that has happened between her and Osmond, and last week's scene, how Osmond is threatening her in the hotel room and saying a teacher doesn't lose his tail like this guy did in the mall.
Right.
I don't think there's any possible way, if she ever believed he was who he was, that she continues to believe that now. Do you think there is?
I mean, it's so, once again, this is the maybe the most difficult part of the show for me right now, although I'm pretty sure it's setting things up for the future. Like you mentioned, the idea that he's just deeply in love with her as being his motivation seems to be unproven at this point, mostly. And then, like you said, like the fact that she's there, there's more to her story. But if she's an operative, she would have definitely known that he would have investigated her and discovered this. So is that how she's being used by, and by what agency, if that is the case? She may just be a pawn in someone else's game, of course. But then, of course, that is luring him into this discovery that this covert Chinese involvement is being exposed in a way due to his investigation. So maybe that is the four-dimensional chess that's going on here. And then who is doing that? I don't know. Because yeah, the fact that she's just not asking questions. I mean, she's asking enough questions to maintain a cover, I would say, but there's way more follow-up questions that she could to ask,
Oh
or
my
wait,
gosh, of course.
right? Yeah, so all of that is, head scratching to me. Speaking of everybody in these rat traps, we have to go to discuss Danny, who, after revealing that she's learning Farsi, etc., she walks outside one day, gets abducted. I have a couple of questions here. One has to do with the fact that, is she properly maintaining her cover if she is getting beaten up this way and she's just a student? Wouldn't, how would you react in this circumstance? A, as an individual, if you were just like, what the hell's going on? Obviously, because she seems pretty tough for someone who's just a non-agent. But then, as an agent, wouldn't you want to act a little more unprepared? Let's say.
I mean, if the first part of your question was if I was not a spy and I was in this situation, I would absolutely just be a heaping, crying mess.
That's what I mean. Exactly.
Yes, absolutely. Just begging them, what is happening? What do you want from me? How do I get out of here? So that is the first part. The second part, yes, she seemed to be trying to like straddle a line
Mhm.
between keeping her
She straddles
cover
something, but yeah, go
and
ahead.
literally, yes, between keeping her cover and being like, WTF is happening here? I shouldn't be in this situation. And it was a very weird gray area to me that she was trying to be in. She seemed to not be wholeheartedly embracing either identity and trying to have them both.
Which makes me ask a couple of questions. One is she not doing a good job, which I've questioned before, and it could be because she's just agreeing to this, or do you think she knows that this is a test?
I don't think she knew it was a test. They gave her a B plus on the
Yes.
test. I guess that's enough. Although to me, the question of why haven't they come from me is pretty telling. I mean, not my family, not my friend. You know what I mean? Like there's a amorphous they.
Right.
So I guess she's good enough at her job. They said B plus, keep it going, right?
I mean, I guess she is a B plus because she never talked, but maybe the B
Correct.
plus, which
Yes.
is not a great grade, I don't think, is exactly what you described. I mean, how is she not just freaking out and saying, what is
True.
going on here?
Yes.
Like she should be, breaking down, or either, there's different ways people react to these things, but she could be just screaming at the top of her lungs, saying, you need to call the consulate. I'm not saying a word to you, like being just totally entitled and freaking out and angry and saying, somebody has to come here. I have some rights. You're in my country, that version of it, or just having a nervous breakdown because she hasn't eaten in a day and has been punched in the face
Sure.
repeatedly and just,
Yes.
not prepared for that, obviously. So some version of this, the fact that she's like, I'm not talking, that doesn't make you look innocent. I'm just letting you know. It makes you look like you're covering something up. And let's wrap up her storyline and then we can go back to
Sure.
Osmond's investigation. Speaking of not understanding her motivations, this guy has punched her in the face multiple times. I guess not that hard though, because she's not bruised up. That would be suspicious. She shows up to school the next day and she's all beat up, doesn't leave any bruises or knows how to hit her without leaving bruises. She then is turned on a little bit. What do you think of this turn of events?
I actually took it as, she's been in a very stressful situation. Emotions are very high, and she's looking for somewhere to vent that stress and anxiety more than a genuine attraction. What I did think was hysterical of his was his response after work. I run at the park. The job that I've seen him do is not one with regular hours. Is this a nine to
Right.
five? Kidnapping people on the street and then harassing them and torturing them and abusing them, but only between business hours. And then after that, he goes for a run at the park. How did she know when to go meet him at the park?
That would be a dead giveaway. He's an agent because if like someone else shows up in the middle of the night to slap her around,
I'm off the clock.
they don't pay overtime. So I got someone else to step in to slap you around. Or maybe she just sat there all day waiting for him to show up.
Yes.
She has
Punch
a lot
back
of downtime.
in.
She's a student. You'd have a pretty flexible schedule. So, and yeah, and then she has sex with him. Any way you read this, it is complicated to say the least about Danny. Because if she's getting slapped around going like, he's kind of cute, that's problematic to say the least. But if on the other hand, she's like, well, after losing control in this circumstance and being abused by the very choices I'm making in my career, I need to take some kind of control here. So I'm going to have sex with my abuser is very problematic, maybe more problematic than the first reading of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
This is weird that the Danny scenes are interjected into this back and forth with Osmond continuously questioning Sammy, which it seems like he's just bothering her every time she's eating something. But but she keeps changing her clothes. So it's a beautiful outfits she's wearing.
She likes a monochrome look. Have you
Yes,
noticed?
that's right. All red, all white. Yep,
Very
absolutely.
dramatic.
How tall is she, by the way? She's pretty. She's much taller than Osmond. No, I think this
I
actress is
haven't
pretty tall.
I haven't noticed, but she certainly gives off a very statuesque aura.
Jodie Turner Smith. She's 5'9". She's probably wearing heels.
5'9" is tall though
It
for a
is.
woman.
Yeah. I do find it interesting where Osmond is questioning her about Paul, his cover story. And she, once again, very hard to read. If she's an agent, she's very good at it because she is fully covering Paul's story. It has filled in blanks that make sense, even in ways that maybe Paul has never directly addressed to her. I like the fact that he has this cover story of writing this book, which seems kind of sad, but they have given him an actual manuscript, by the way, which I find interesting. And at the very beginning of the episode, he is erasing some edits he made and leaving the eraser remnants inside of the manuscript. Of course, he's looking to see if anyone's read through it. So that's all part of his cover story. This is a pretty silly cover story, I have to say, but regardless, it's interesting to see like that. In a way, the show is filling in some of his biographical details, or at least her perception of his biography. Once again, if we can trust anything we're seeing at all.
I liked how marked up the manuscript was. It had a ton of post-its in it.
Yes.
All of it was made to seem very realistic.
That's like a very good bit of stage decoration. Once again, I think this is part of the reason that people who make movies and TV series, and we're seeing so many of these, the whole idea of spies being such a popular theme is because it is like making a movie, right? Like someone had to mark up that script. And whoever is the prop person at the agency has to do a similar thing, right? And people have to write stories like being like, okay, how do I get this character into this situation? And of course, the scriptwriter needs to do that when they're writing a script. The agency needs to come up with these backstories and explanations. Well, we're going to book you on a trip to go here. We're going to put you in this class. We're going to create a story for you. And then, of course, the actors, the agents have to perform these different roles. So I think that's definitely the case where there is an affinity between the idea of an agent and an actor. And that's probably part of the appeal of making all these shows.
I would love to be the person responsible for that prop as someone who's received many a handwritten criticism on my writing.
As has, whoever marked that script
up, yes,
of course, is probably an actual writer on the show, or at least consulted with one. So it's very legitimate looking, I'm sure.
We used to have a paralegal that we would joke like he's single-handedly keeping 3M in business because he would flag so much in our citations.
Maybe that's why so many lawyers become writers, maybe
it's a chance to actually creatively express yourself without worrying about somebody critiquing every single word. Although I guess your editor does that when you're a writer.
That's true. Although given the writing on a lot of these shows, I don't know how much editing they're getting anymore.
Fair.
Okay, a little side point here, one little detail that just touching on some of the themes about who's a good agent, who's not a good agent. It's so difficult to read these scenes once again, because you don't know who's lying and who's not lying. You see Martian goes to the police station, supposedly to file a report on the mugging, which, by the way, people in his office also said he should do because they think it's an actual mugging. So he goes there. So he's performing A, for the office. B, he has to stay in the Paul Lewis persona. And of course, you would probably go file a report on the mugging. And C, he is an actual agent and almost certainly knows that this guy who he saw before
Mm-hmm.
is tailing him.
Right.
And he spends an hour and 45 minutes in the building and then exits. But then, of course, the tail goes in immediately wearing the jacket because it's a nice jacket. I want that jacket too, by the way. So,
Do you know? I'm sorry, don't lose your train of thought. But
yeah.
there is a website that tells you where different pieces of clothing
Oh, I'm
on
sure
TV
this
came
jacket's going to
from.
be outside my pay
It's,
grade. Although I
I
guess if
think
he's an
it's,
agent, he probably doesn't have a $4,000 jacket, I would assume.
I think it's called As Seen on TV. There are probably multiple websites, but the one I know of, I think is called As Seen on TV. But yes, although there's sometimes are very expensive pieces, I'm not sure if it's that website or not, but you could easily just pull the image and put it into
Yes.
Google search and it will
Yes.
give you similar jackets that may be in your price range.
That's a very good point. I was actually thinking that exact thing because you can now on my this is all side digressions, but now the Google search that is integrated into the iPhone Photos app. So if you go down to the options down below the image, there's actually like a lens, a Google Lens search.
Right. As Seen on TV brings you to all of those infomercial products, but
Oh no,
worn on TV
worn
will
on
give
TV.
you, yes.
I will make sure to clean that up in the
Should
edits.
I don't want to misdirect anybody.
So yeah, so he's obviously knows the tail is there. The guy's wearing his jacket, and he probably spotted him, or definitely spotted him before when he was about to get beat up. So given all that, he has to assume that that agent is going to follow up on him.
Yes.
So is this a trap he's setting?
Such a good point, and something that I hadn't considered because I was like, what on earth? He went in there and this guy comes out and says he didn't file a report. So what was happening in there? That's such a great point.
Well, I assume he was just sitting in there and making it look like I'm spending like once it's exactly what they're falling into, where they're like, aha, he didn't file a report
Well, yes, if he's setting a trap, yes.
because he could have filed a report and then that would have
Exactly. That's why I said, why wouldn't you? You already went there. Just go through
even
the
if he wouldn't have done it,
motions.
even like in any other circumstance, if he's like, well, I wouldn't have filed the report because I don't want the complication because I'm an agent. I don't want people to ask too many questions. But in this particular case, if he goes in there and he's like, he files a claim under Paul Lewis, he still has the ID that says Paul Lewis. He could still use that ID and they'll walk in there and say, like, yeah, he filed a claim, right? I'm not sure how you walk into a police agency and go like, hey, was there a guy here called Paul Lewis that opened, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not sure how that.
Well, I think they said something about he went
Oh,
in
he
to
was
file
saying
his
he was a
own
witness to it, right?
claim. Yeah, something like that.
That would make sense. Being like, oh, did someone come in here and claim that blah 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 blah, and someone took their jacket, and they'll be like, yeah, we just had somebody here. I think I witnessed it, and then let me just give you my details. That would make sense, right? They take the witness statement.
Yeah,
And
they did
yeah,
explain it in some way that they had asked a certain question to somebody and they said no, nobody had reported that.
yeah. So this makes me wonder if it is suspicious that he didn't do it, and also suspicious that he performed that he had done it, which would be enough of a trap to be set here. So I think he's trying to lure them out. And I do think that it's probably intentional because he probably wants to get ahead of them in the fact that he probably also knows that his daughter's ID was on his person, which, by the way, never carry that around with you, man, as an agent. Like, you know, it's
Yeah,
especially if
did
you're
they
being tailed.
explain why he had that?
Actually, no, I don't know what that would, why he'd have that, right? Because he wouldn't need it to have it on a regular basis. So yeah, that's odd. Yeah.
I was thinking maybe she left it behind and he picked it up and put it in his
Oh,
jacket. Oh, I'll
yeah,
give this back to her. And I had missed that scene somehow.
yeah, that's a good explanation because yeah, it's like her college ID, which she probably needs. So he probably was carrying it with her, like to say, "Oh, I'm going to see her at lunch this week.
Right.
I'll give it back to her." Yeah, so I think that's probably the case. I don't think it was in the show itself, though.
Would have been
But
nice to just have a quick 10-second thing to tie
yeah,
it
just
together.
call her, just get her on the
Yeah.
phone, or leave her a voicemail saying, "I have your
Yeah.
ID if you were looking for it. By the
Right.
way,
A
eat
text even.
lunch."
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, even a text. He obviously now knows that she potentially is at risk. Her last name, of course, doesn't match his last name. That's part of Osmond's questioning of Samia later on. What's her name? He asks. You know, if she has a different name, maybe the mother's name or something like that. But of course, this is very suspicious that the last names don't match. And it's her real name. Like, this is once again, why does he have this ID on him? He really should not be carrying it.
Mm-hmm.
Reinforcing the idea that most of the people here in the show, if not all of them, are not great agents. They've all violated, by the way, everybody has this like strict code of conduct. You can lose your job for any of these things. You cannot be in a relationship with somebody in the office. You cannot, use an old ID that you burned. Henry's leaking stuff to his brother-in-law, probably improperly having those conversations in the open with his wife in the house. And Paul has his previous identity that he's still actively using. And Owen is inept at his job, and Danny is now hooking up with another agent, and that agent's out of compliance as well. Everybody's breaking the rules all the time, which I think is part of the point that the show's trying to make to some extent.
Yeah, the country's being held together with chewing gum and string, or whatever that phrase is.
And they're all
Or
expected
national
to be like,
security.
yeah, it goes back to that sequence, that really great in episode 3, that first conversation, interrogation practically, with Dr. Blake, where Martian is saying you have to be mentally ill to be able to supposedly do what you expect. And then it's that catch-22, literally, right? If you are considered mentally insane, then you probably shouldn't be doing this job because, or God forbid, people knew that you were, this unstable and doing this job. And then simultaneously, you're a human being. How can you be expected to be completely, dehumanized, literally, like just
Right.
basically program yourself and then turn it off when you need to, and never acknowledge your emotions or your opinions. It's like it's an impossibility. So the job is impossible,
Right.
and everybody's pretending that it's rule based. There is another very funny scene, by the way, when Blake is listening in on Owen's debriefing. She, is scratching her head as to some of his activity, and he's like, "I think I need to have a session with you." After my experience here. So of
I'll
course, he's going to
pencil
smooth
you
everything.
in.
She's like,
Hysterical.
but her face when she's like, yeah, I'll pencil you in. Like, she's like, not the most important thing happening right now.
Hysterical.
This is, like you said, a very dark comedy at this point, because Martian is walking around the office with a bruised up face. And it's like, what happened? He's like, I don't want to talk about it. I think that people want to know. And by the way, even if it was all innocent, people would want to know. But this is not all innocent, right? Like, his identity, his daughter's well-being, the agency's cover for him, and their current investigations are all potentially impacted by what's happening
Yes.
with him, and he's not sharing it with anybody.
Kind of high stakes. Yeah.
So towards the end of the episode, we see that Martian's back at his apartment. He's being visited by this new character we haven't seen before, I don't believe, played by Hugh Bonneville from Downton Abbey, and
Oh, I have no idea who that is. Okay.
who's also the dad in the Paddington movies, by the way.
Oh, I've heard those are excellent.
They are. They really are. There's a third one coming out. It's already a huge hit overseas. Presumably, Hugh Bonneville will be on the show again. You don't really cast this way, I would assume, just for one little cameo. And I guess he's just filling him in on the situation, why the Chinese are potentially involved with or curious about this. Basically, the question you asked earlier: would you like to have this patio in London?
I would like to have any patio, honestly.
That's a good point. Good point.
This one might technically be a terrace. I
A
lose
terrace,
track
yes.
of what's a balcony, what's a terrace. I'm not sure. I would take it for sure.
He's listening to 70s psychedelic African rock again. I'm not sure if this is his record collection or the whoever he's apartment he's supposedly inherited. I think it's supposed to be the record collection that was already there, but it is very much on theme. And then at the very end of the episode, we see that Osmond is talking to this Chinese agent and basically saying, you need to get rid of this person for me. And the Chinese agent says, I'm not no bin man. I'm not taking out your trash for you. And they seem to discuss that there might be some leverage they have, which I think is indicating that they're going to use Poppy in some way, I think. And that's where we leave things for this episode.
Yeah,
We're
that's
about
what I
halfway.
was afraid of for Poppy. I am
Very much
concerned.
so. Yeah. So here we are halfway through the season at this point. How do you feel about how they're setting everything up? What direction the show might be going in?
I'm really enjoying it, especially this last episode I particularly liked. I do still miss the brother-in-law character. I hope we get to see what he's been up to. But other than that, I feel like things are moving along and developing nicely. I'm interested in the ideas. I'm interested in the plot. And I'm looking forward to watching the rest. How about you?
Yeah, I very much still enjoying it. Yeah, very intriguing, I think. And I like the fact that I can't get a handle on everyone's motivations. And this is kind of what I come to these shows for. We discussed The Night Manager here on the podcast. That's very much the kind of vibes I had watching that series, where I don't know for long periods of time whether the romantic entanglement there in that series is legitimate or whether
Right.
it's part of the play. And I think that is what we're seeing play out here as well. I really enjoy that aspect of the show, and all of that duplicity, of course, throughout for all these different characters. I would say that I felt more sexual chemistry between those characters in that show than I do here.
Oh, for
Um,
sure, by miles.
which is
Yeah,
part, yeah, one of the big selling points for that show for sure is seeing these very attractive, very tall people.
very tall.
Both, yeah. She's Elizabeth Debicki is very tall. She's like 6'3" or something,
Yeah.
and I think Tom Hiddleston's like 6'2". She's like taller than he is. So yeah, so that is once again we recommended that. But when it's coming back, I've already mentioned this, but definitely coming back 2025 sometime 2025. The follow-up season of that show 8 years later. 8 years later, so
Yeah, that
just a
feels like a
mere 8 years later.
lifetime in television time. How many episodes are left of this?
Five more, so we're halfway.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thanks again for the conversation.
Thank you. I'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Okay.